To help us explore more deeply what it actually means to run for office, we're joined today by Brianna Thomas, who's a legislative aide to City Council member Lorena Gonzalez. Brianna, you yourself have run for office before.
I did, Eric. In 2015, the city of Seattle moved back to the district system, and I ran in District 1 for West Seattle. There are about 9 of us in the race in the primary.
And this was for Seattle City Council.
That's right.
Okay, so there's 9 of you in the primary. It's an open seat, right?
It is.
Which is a somewhat rare thing to happen. And so what made you decide to run? Like just before you even get into the actual running, like what was that process where you decided to cross that line?
Well, I had been a campaign manager for several years before that, worked with elected officials on all sorts of levels and on initiative campaigns. And like most people that watch instead of do, I was certain that I was going to be excellent at it. And I'd also asked several young women to run for office. And so there was some accountability for me when an opportunity showed up to actually do the thing.
That's interesting. So you actually felt that because you'd asked others to run, that now there was an opportunity. It's like you couldn't hide.
Absolutely, right? Like it would have been hard to make that ask afterwards, after passing up an opportunity.
Ah, interesting. Okay, so you make that decision to go for it, and you had worked in politics before, as you say, as a campaign manager, and you'd worked in Olympia, also as an aide. So you were not a total neophyte to politics, but still, it's first time running. What were the first things that you had to contend with? Was it money? Was it people? Was it just certain key constituents? Like what were the first things you had to start worrying about?
I think the first thing that I worried about was my family, and I wanted to call them and prepare them for what I'd seen on the outside. And running for office teaches you so much about yourself. Making sure that I had that foundation to launch from was the first most important thing. The second thing I had to get used to is people saying things to me on the bus. First thing in the morning, 7:15, what are you doing about potholes? And that was something I hadn't planned on.
And what would you say in these early in the early going when people first started approaching you like this? Were you just like, okay, I guess game on, and you just dived into talking points?
It depended on the day. Sometimes I pled for compassion because it was 7:15 for me too on the bus. But sometimes that's where folks are and they want to talk to you, and public service is very public, and so the best you can do is say, hey, that's why I'm running. I am also incredibly frustrated with the hours at the senior center and the potholes.
Yeah, and so okay. So you've crossed the line. You're diving in here. As you go, what surprised you about either how hard or how easy it was as you started campaigning?
I think one of the bigger challenges was creating a sense of legitimacy. Politics has been traditionally governed by who's got the most powerful friends and the biggest bank account. And being a relative newcomer to the public at large, establishing legitimacy based on my age and my gender and my experience was a lot harder than I thought it would be. People at the door would ask me, do you remember 2008? Well, yes, I do. I do remember 2008. One of the things that was great about it, though, was how welcoming people were. I got a lot of folks that were just like, I may not have been keyed in, but you look like me, you sound like me, you've got a similar background. And it's kind of exciting to have someone that I really relate to that's tangible on my doorstep.
So the first part of what you're saying, establishing legitimacy. So people who were, in fact, used to more, quote unquote, traditional candidates, whiter, maler than you are, right? Older, right? Okay, so sometimes it sounds like that was unspoken, and sometimes it was people came straight out and said, are you even qualified for this? Is that
right? Are you old enough to be doing this? Even there are some unintentional biases at candidate forums. I was the youngest person running and the only person of color, and I found myself in some situations literally with the shortest seat at the table. Luckily, I ran with a group of candidates that were very supportive of each other while we ran, and they didn't let that stand.
So in your own work, I mean, number one, confronting that when someone just straight up questions your legitimacy in a role, which doesn't happen in most people's lives, right? How did you contend with that? So you kept your game face on, but over time in a campaign, I think this is a critical thing, right? I mean, a lot of folks watching who have never run for office, maybe have been thinking about it during these times. That might be one of the biggest hurdles, that it's not so much that people will say mean things about me or ask me questions on the bus, but people will question whether I even belong here, right?
Right.
How did you get over that?
I just remembered that we all have something to offer to a civic conversation. There is no one form of community. There's no one lived experience. And governing when done best and civic engagement when done best includes all of us. So I might not be a subject matter expert on wastewater treatment, but I can tell you what it's like to be a 35-year-old renter in the city of Seattle better than anybody else on this panel. And that's a legitimacy that I spoke from.
That's interesting. And so, that work of starting authentically from your known and lived experience, I think probably was a source of strength initially. And then as you started thinking, okay, in a 9-way race where you've got to, build a certain kind of coalition that maybe expands beyond your initial base, again, how did you start figuring out how to expand your sense of coalition there?
Well, I think I try to, one, be responsive. There are these questionnaires that will come at you fast and furiously, and that just
From
gets you
different
thinking.
like interest groups. And,
Absolutely. You've got labor unions to folks who care about trees, to educators, to PTAs. Everybody has an opinion on how they'd like to see their community run, and they'd like to know where you stand on that. So that really helps get you thinking and moving you in the right direction. They've got deadlines, you schedule around it. But I think the conversations that I had that pushed me a little bit outside of my boundaries, I was running from the perspective of serving workers. I hadn't thought about the fact that I needed to speak with the chamber about what my vision for workers were. Luckily, they reached out to me. And you start having that really transparent and honest conversation. Are you going to agree with everybody on everything? Absolutely not. But that doesn't mean you don't come to the table and try to find some alignment. And the more you do that, the easier it is to think about your community holistically.
Interesting. So ultimately, you were not successful in this, your first foray in elective office, but...
I was not elected. I was successful.
Okay. All right. That's actually interesting. So unpack that for me.
Sure. I think for me, one, just the learning experience about what it's like to be out there in the public eye gave me a lot of empathy for folks who are actually governing. But I currently work for a council member, Lorena Gonzalez, who I'd never met a day in my life before running for office. And although I didn't win my race, I still work in City Hall. I still get to work with her and other coalition members on creating great policy that's leading the nation. So I think there's a lot of ways that you don't win your election, but I'm still here doing what was my desired outcome, so that feels like a win.
I love that. And, part of what, going back to earlier in your career when you were trying to encourage other people, especially other women and maybe women of color, to throw their hat in the ring and run for office. So, now we're in a time where, because of national politics, there's just this incredible wave of people who are either have decided or are thinking about running for office for the first time.
Sure.
Many of them will not have as much experience as you even had prior to your first run, right? I mean, you had seen politics from the inside. You understood a bit what it was about.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to people who right now are watching and have been thinking about, maybe I should run for something, but I know even less than Brianna did when she started. Like, what would you say to them about how they can get over that hump?
I think I'd stay focused on the fact that governing isn't just the people you see on TV. There are water and sewer commissions that need people to serve, that regularly have vacancies at the local level. The county has boards and commissions that you can serve on. There's more than one way to get your hat in the ring and potentially win. And I think that we sort of drift our narrative to Congress and to the flashier positions, but governance happens at every level of all of our communities, and there's a place for everyone to plug in. Plus, it's nice to get a little experience before you go for a bigger seat.
Yeah, and I think fundamentally for you, because you'd had a lot of experience working in community, forget about calling it politics,
Sure.
but it was dealing with different people in different communities and constituencies and situations. What you're saying to folks, if they're thinking about running, is get that experience first, and then running will seem less like a brand new thing, right?
Absolutely. People have lots of ways to get involved in their communities now, whether it's the PTA, whether it's a gardening club, whether it's doing direct services with homeless on the weekends, whether any little bit that you do to connect yourself to your community intentionally is a little bit of running. You're meeting with somebody, you're sharing an idea, you're taking collective action together, and that's something that you can build on to move forward for any position. Okay,
last question for you. So, I think one of the greatest fears that people might have as they're contemplating this, if they're contemplating it, is something you alluded to, which is that public service is public, that there's just nonstop exposure. Was that a thing that the course of the campaign. What would you tell folks now, having lived through this, about, come on in, the water's not that cold,
Yeah, it's I'm not gonna, sugarcoat it. It's tough. There are days where you don't want anyone to ask you anything about anything. Really, you probably just want someone to bring you dinner. I think that what I would tell them is, there's no perfect litmus test. You're not going to get anything right on the first try, so don't let that fear be a barrier. And there's always time for a second run.
So do you think about a second run?
Sure I do. Absolutely.
Good. Well, we look forward to seeing that unfold someday soon, and really appreciate your joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
My guest today has been Brianna Thomas. She's a legislative aide to City Council member Lorena Gonzalez and has been a longtime Politico and a one-time candidate for office soon, some point down the road, a second-time candidate. We look forward to hearing more about her.